So we are now online, and I guess we should wait a few more minutes for more viewers. So I think we can start. I welcome you all to this panel discussion, this cooperation between the European Union of Jewish Students and the Jewish Student Union of Germany, and thanks for the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, because this panel discussion is part of the Action Weeks Against Anti-Semitism in Germany. And for those who don't know what happened in Halle 1 year ago during Yom Kippur, I will give a short overview about the case. So 1 year ago on Yom Kippur, on the holiest day in Judaism, a right-wing terrorist tried to enter the synagogue in Halle during the prayer. He failed, not because of police or security forces. He failed because of a wooden door. In front of the synagogue, he murdered Jana, and afterwards he drove to a Turkish kebab shop where he tried to kill as many Muslims and Turks as possible. In the end, he murdered Kevin inside the doner shop, inside the doner kebab shop. And after an escape, he drove with a car and injured two other people. A few months ago, the trial against him started, and this is what happens exactly 1 year ago. And we want to talk about what happened in this year, what steps have been taken, what we can do. And I'm very happy to have a very professional panel today, and I will introduce very briefly our panelists. We have Katharina von Schnurbein. She is the coordinator on combating anti-Semitism and forceful Jewish life in the European Commission. Thanks for being here tonight, Katharina. Then we have Grisha Staniek, co-founder and board member of 𝐷EMOC. What exactly 𝐷EMOC is, he will tell us. And he's also the director of EUJS, and also what this is, he will tell us. Thanks for being here tonight. Then we have Rebecca Blakey. Rebecca has been in the synagogue during the attack. She's a survivor of this right-wing terrorist attack, and she's also the executive director of Hillel Germany, and also the co-founder of the Central Project based Berlin. And Rebecca is a very good friend of both of us, of JSUD and EUJS, and I'm very happy to have you here tonight, Rebecca. And our last panelist is Dr. Matthias Quent. He's a sociologist and founding director of the Institute for Democracy and Civil Society in Jena. My name is 𝐅𝐮𝐭𝐮𝐫𝐿. I'm the vice president of the European Union of Jewish Students, but also of the Jewish Student Union in Germany. And yes, let's get started. And yes, when I try to remember these moments, I'm stuck by overwhelming panic. This is what Rebecca said during the trial in few weeks ago. And my first question is, Rebecca, how do you feel today, 1 year after the attack? How are you, and what have been changed in your life?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me join you. And thank you for the question. It certainly has not been an easy year, but there are a lot of things that I've done, that I've been supported in doing, and that I've seen that have led to this point being 1 year later, being much, much better than last year. Thankfully, I've been able to secure funds from the Ministry of Justice to pursue my own therapy. I've been working with a trauma therapist who has been exceptionally helpful. And so I've been able to really work on integrating the trauma from last year. It was, for me, an intergenerational trauma because my grandparents all survived the Shoah. I even had one grandma in particular experience something similar as I did on that day with regard to being separated from her family members. And so working out this trauma was a big part of the past year for me, but I'm very pleased to say that I've made a lot of progress. And part of what that progress has enabled me to do is to come to realize that I feel like I have a unique voice at this point, in being able to speak up against right-wing extremism, when it's motivated by anti-Semitism, when it's motivated by xenophobia or racism or any other kind of hatred against human beings. I've long believed that this is a Jewish value, and now it feels distinctly a responsibility that I have. And so as we look forward, I'm trying to actually bring a lot of the strength that I've been able to build up into joining this cause. For me personally, that's really important. And I know that for many in our Jewish community, it's also something that's it's a cause that's very dear to them. And looking for a Jewish outlet, specifically Jewish outlet to do that, is something that I'm thinking a lot about right now. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Definitely. Katharina, within your role and in reflecting on the attack, where do you think the focus should lie in trying to prevent attacks such as Halle from happening again on European or on EU soil? Because I think this is maybe something unique, what happened last year. And yes.
Yeah, I really think that the shock of when we first heard about it is still with us. I mean, I think that those who are engaged with the Jewish community immediately realized the enormity on Yom Kippur in Germany, you know, a mere wooden door protecting and all of these aspects. And I think that it has in a way had a real impact on not only Germany, but also the European understanding just how important security is, but that it's not only about security of buildings. Yeah, I mean, in the end, every individual must feel secure in order to see a future. And I think that we reacted in different ways immediately after the attack. One was that we sent another letter to the member states following a debate that we had with them in June already about increasing the security of Jewish premises. We bring together different Jewish communities from member states and representatives from member states regularly to make sure that they talk to each other. And the first topic we had following council conclusions on anti-Semitism that were adopted by unanimity in 2018 was really on security. And then we didn't see much follow-up. And so this letter had been actually prepared already, but it had taken a while to issue it, and I sent it on the day after Halle to make sure that member states really understand and the security forces understand what the dimension of this. And then we had, as you may know, a change of European Commission. Now we have President von der Leyen. She, 10 days into her mandate, held a speech which was called After Halle, From Words to Action, where she also committed to increasing not only security, but also fostering Jewish life, bringing the fight against anti-Semitism to the top of the agenda of the European Commission. We have since had, for example, with regards to security, different areas from a security union package, which concerns broader security, but also includes the Jewish community. It includes also a call for the protection of places of worship that we launched across the EU, where either different communities can work together or member states with communities can work together. And we have taken, I think, also a broader view with regards to what needs to happen in counter-radicalization. We have started a study into right-wing extremist networks online. We see that the link from conspiracy myths to hate crime is very short, and that we must make sure that we know what is happening online in order to make sure that we can actually prevent these kind of things from happening. And we must stop to talk about lone wolves, because it's very clear that there are networks behind. They might not work in the traditional way as we have seen, as we saw them in the 70s and 80s, but very clearly these people are inspired by certain ideas. They have certain worldviews that can go against the Jews or other minorities, and the threshold to actually acting out what feeds them through the net seems to be increasingly low, as we see also that anti-Semitic tropes that we would not have heard maybe 10 years ago, we can hear again now. So for us, this is one aspect, the security aspect, and the other aspect, if I may, is the whole aspect of training, law enforcement, and that is on the one side to know what anti-Semitism is and the different forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, how it expresses itself, from the traditional aspects of religious, racist anti-Semitism, to conspiracy myths, to Holocaust denial, to anti-Zionism. All these different forms coming from the different areas of society, but also for police forces. And we know, and I follow actually the DEMOC reports very closely online. Thanks a lot for doing this, because it shows also the huge lack of understanding among the police forces of, what does it mean if a Jewish community in a synagogue switches on a mobile phone on Yom Kippur? Is this something that the police must know? And I believe that they should not only know it for the Jewish community, but in a diverse society, we need to know this also about other religions, about other communities. So we have worked on training for police, and we think that the IHRA definition is a good basis also for knowing about anti-Semitism and for making sure that there is a recognition that all forms are equally pernicious. So it's these two aspects, I think, where we have a lot invested over the past years: security on the one side, training on the other, facing all the facts, and for example, a EU-funded project that is in particular an anti-bias training also for police online. So there are lots of different things happening. We understand that we can do whatever we want on European level, unless it's actually member states and cities and mayors and the police locally acting things out. Nothing will change, neither for the Jewish community nor for society at large. So this is why it is so important that the things that we decide on European level actually then trickle down. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the insights of the European Commission and also from your work, what you are doing. I want to go on to Matthias. In a few days, your new book, Right-Wing Extremism, 33 questions, 33 answers will be published. And I have actually one question about right-wing extremism and also what Katharina said. This attack was different than right-wing attacks in the 70s or 80s. Is this a new dimension of right-wing terrorism in Germany or in Europe? What do you think about this attack in Halle?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this important session, and many thanks for the statements. So to the question, no and yes. In recent months, after the far-right murder of Walter Lübcke, after the anti-Semitic attack in Halle and the deadly racist violence in Hanau, sometimes the wrong impression has been given that right-wing terrorism in Germany is something new. this is, or in Europe. This is in fact not true. There is a bloody tradition of far-right terrorists and as well anti-Semitic violence before and after 1945. After the liberation of Europe from national socialism, right-wing terrorist structures emerged from the 1960s onwards. On the last weekend, we had to remember the 40th anniversary of the most serious, deadly far-right attack until today, the attack on the Oktoberfest in Munich with 13 fatalities. Also, indications of the far-right background and the suspected perpetrators' connections to the paramilitary group, so-called Wehrsportgruppe Hoffmann, were known from the beginning. The act was presented and classified as the act of a confused individual perpetrator, as a lone wolf, as it was called. Only a few weeks after this attack in 1980s, and also with connections to the Hoffmann group in Erlangen, the Rabbi Shlomo Levin and his partner was murdered by a far-right extremist. There were numerous attacks on synagogues, on Jewish cemeteries. The bomb attack in Düsseldorf in 2000 are examples of how anti-Semitic hate crimes and right-wing terrorism has repeatedly occurred. The journalist Ronald Steinke has summarized this in his very readable current book, Terror Against Jews, but I think it's just in German until now. So in the last 30 years, more than 200 people have been killed in Germany by far-right violence, and in a lot of these cases, anti-Semitism played a role. For example, the so-called National Socialist Underground, NSU, murdered 9 immigrants and 1 policewoman, but the terrorists also listed numerous Jewish institutions and as potential targets, and they spied out a synagogue in Berlin. Members of the Bürgerwehr Freital, which carried out attacks against leftists and refugees, talked about Jewish cops in their chats. Anti-Semitism, which claims that the Jewish world conspiracy is the real cause for all alleged evils, is very widespread in the far-right extremist spectrum since ever. These so-called COG, the Zionist occupied governments, as they call it, in their eyes, they are controlling the government, they are controlling the police, and they are responsible for that, what the far-right is calling the great replacement, as well as for feminism, like the perpetrator from Halle mentioned as well, and all things the far-right think that is evil. Franco Albrecht, who is a soldier in the German Federal Army Armed Forces, is accused of planning right-wing terrorist attacks, and he presented this old ideology of a supposed subversion by Jews very broadly in his master's thesis years ago. The right-wing terrorist who shot 9 immigrants in Munich on July 22 was in the year 2016. He was an anti-Semite. In his chat he chats on his computer, he incited against Israel, among other things. His role model was a Norwegian far-right terrorist Anders Breivik, who killed a total of 77 people in Oslo and Utøya in 2011, and is now considered a role model for many right-wing terrorists, including the Christchurch attack and the assassin in Halle. And anti-Semitism plays a structural role in right-wing terrorist ideologies. In the case of Breivik, who in his 1,500 pages manifesto wrote, among other things, that the Jews in Western Europe were no longer the main problem because of the Shoah. But he called above all young social democrats, whom he described as so-called cultural Marxists. And these internal enemies, in his eyes, he argued, would let the external enemies, especially Muslims, into the country, and were therefore the primary problem. And this anti-Semitic conspiracy narrative of cultural Marxism was a cipher for the Jewish world conspiracy. This has been spreading more and more over the past 20 years, even in the current demonstrations against the corona measures. And so far as anti-Semitism is always a projection, it is not only directed against Jews themselves. It was Hitler who not only incited against Jews, but also against those who, in his words, would work for Jewish interests. Thus, through this anti-Semitic mania, politicians, activists, intellectuals, and business leaders are also targeted by anti-Semites, even they are not Jews. But they fulfill the purpose of the anti-Semitic projection that is inherent in right-wing extremism, and this ideology is anything but new and has never been done. So one more point back to the question. I said whether it is a new dimension, yes or no, and argued why not. But in this intensity of violence directed against Jews, which the perpetrator from Halle intended, the attack in Halle was certainly a new quality in Germany. Not absolutely, but comparatively new in a deadly attack is also the dimension of the networking and radicalization in social networks, as Katharina mentioned it, and the global right-wing subculture to which the perpetrator directed his messages. This was shown, among other things, in his manifesto and his terrible live stream. He spoke English. He was not connected to local far-right structures, but to far-right extremists in the whole world. And so the answer is yes and no.
Well, thanks a lot for this historic background and everything, because I think a lot of people don't know about right-wing terror, about the history of right-wing terrorism in Germany and also in Europe. I think we should come back also to what I said, new dimension of right-wing terrorism. Grisha, you are part of 𝐷EMOG. You can tell us what 𝐷EMOG is, but for example, 𝐷EMOG monitors for right-wing rallies, also right-wing Telegram channels. Maybe you can give us an insight about how the new right or the alternative right and also neo-Nazis today are communicating. Also, like we're talking about what Matthias was mentioned about image boards like 4chan and 8chan. Please give us an insight about how this right-wing communication is working nowadays.
Thanks, Ruben, for having us, for having me. Thanks a lot. So right on the day of the attack, we already saw that the material, the videos, his uploads, his files, his PDFs or manifesto, however you want to call it, was already disseminated on channels like Telegram or certain boards that were used before to distribute far-right terrorist content. And in this case, we looked on the day of the attack and we basically found what he wanted to send to the world, and unfortunately it worked. So things are still up and online on Telegram. The channels are still up and online. You mentioned image boards. So there are different boards that the perpetrator, but also other perpetrators were active. Unfortunately, no one in this trial, as we see it, is actually informed about the background, about how they work, what means being anonymous, what means being a moderator. No one is informed so far as we see it, unfortunately, what the language is, what codes they're using. One could think, oh, maybe in such a case, in such a trial, people would, I don't know, get background information or invite scientists, invite experts to court to read their books. But so far, unfortunately, no one or very few people did it in this trial, especially when it comes to the prosecutors. So I really appreciate what Katharina von Schnorber said, that there has to be some education done on the side of the prosecution, police, state prosecution, but also the judge, and also some people who are sitting in court who are representing co-plaintiffs. I think have to do some research. So thanks a lot for having us. I wanted to add something. What's also very important, I wanted to say here, to not make the mistake to reproduce the narratives when it comes to online activities, for example, to reproduce the narratives of the perpetrator, for example, the narrative of the far right. We have to look very closely what's wrong, what he wishes that we think. He wants a myth to disseminate worldwide, a myth of the globally well-connected far right, but in some very specific cases, it might not be true. Some people want to be part of it, but might not be part of it. Some people are copying codes. Some people are making references. Some people are doing so-called dog whistling, for example. And I also think in this specific Halle trial, we see that a lot, that things are being said in court for others to listen, for others to, it's also a difference in age. Some people, I think, don't get the references. So the perpetrator gets a platform, unfortunately, to say these things out loud and get cheers from other far-right activists. Until today, we see on Telegram people praising him and other attackers as a saint or as a white supremacist saint. And by doing that, sorry. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yes, definitely. And thanks for the evaluation of the online content. And we are already getting to the trial itself. Before we go to the trial, I want to remember our audience that you can ask questions in the chat or message the EUJS directly, and we will answer all your questions afterwards. And now we have one of around 40 co-plaintiffs here, Rebecca, and Grisha already talked about what went wrong in the trial so far. Maybe you can give your expectation from the trial, what the German society, the German politics, but also on the European level, what are your expectations out of this trial?
Sure. So I would say that there are two levels for me to answer that question. On one level, the goal of being a co-plaintiff in this trial is for a sense of personal justice. And the second level is that the trial, I think, is an opportunity for us, who are sitting in that courtroom to actually give some voice and exposure to exactly the issues that we've been talking about here. And actually in many ways, that's really my hope in being part of this, is that we can shed light on some of these greater issues, because it seems very clear to me that this perpetrator belongs in prison and for a very long time. But what we can do is actually, for example, as Matthias was saying, look into this global right-wing subculture and all the different ways that it manifests. Look at how it infiltrates into our societal power structures, including, as was said before, law enforcement, justice systems, politicians, and so forth. I think that there is a big opportunity to do that. And I also think, there is something very, very meaningful about being part of this as a co-plaintiff, because of all of the different ways that I think each of us who are participating this way were touched personally. So while I do believe that an important goal of the trial is to make this difference in society, I think that it's also very important, especially as the anniversary comes up, for all of these survivors to be able to have a moment where they can regain some strength. I will say that on the first day of the trial, I went to court. I've only been twice. I've been on the first day of the trial and on the day that I testified. And I had extreme anxiety about going into that courtroom and being face to face with the perpetrator, a person who wanted me dead. And I was sitting there and I was listening because on the first day of the trial, the judge was asking questions of the perpetrator. And at first that was extremely difficult for me. I didn't want to hear what he had to say. I didn't care. I wondered why we were spending so much time listening to the things coming out of his mouth. But after, and I mean, this was going on for a while. So I would say maybe after an hour or something like this of listening to this exchange between the judge and the perpetrator, I realized that what was going on was enlightening in some sense, because as we were sitting there, we were able to actually see very publicly how somebody like this is thinking about Jewish people, about minorities, about himself, about weapons and violence. And for me, coming face to face with that thought process made me realize the urgency of the kinds of questions that we're talking about now, because this person totally believes what he's saying to be legitimate, which only goes to show how important all of the work that my co-panelists on this call are doing right now. He doesn't think he's crazy. He thinks he's totally sane, and that the things that he's advocating for are totally legitimate and should be done in the world. So it was interesting to realize that. On one hand, it gave me a lot of that strength that I had been seeking going into this process, because I realized that this is so clearly an enemy. This is so clearly part of a larger constellation of violence and extremism and hatred that is now surfaced. And now we see how much we need to fight, how much we need to do to fight against it. And then on the other hand, I also realized that it comes at a price, because every day that he has a platform comes with a cost, because we don't know who's actually listening to that. And it's made me very aware of the various choices that are made in this trial, of whether to give him a platform or not. There was actually, the day I testified, I was able to share some of my grandmother's story about her arrival at Auschwitz in my testimony, which was a very, very big deal for me, because she survived Auschwitz, she survived forced labor in Germany, she was ultimately liberated from Bergen-Belsen. She never had an opportunity to testify before a German court, an international court of any kind. And then there I was, able to share her story, particularly as it related to my trauma. So for me, that was very powerful. And the defendant wanted to make a statement after I testified. We had a decision from the co-plaintiffs not to remain in the room, because we wanted to show that we did not want to give him a platform. And in fact, you know, that the Holocaust, the history, the fact that what he did is wrong, like that's not on trial right now. The thing that's on trial is him, and the issues that need to be raised are exactly what we're talking about now. How we can use these moments of exposure in order to do better and not spend too much time giving him a stage that costs us too much. So that's kind of where I'm seeing, or where I'm hoping the effects of the trial will make a difference for us in this society, and also in global society, because this is a problem beyond Germany, in Europe, and also beyond Europe as well.
Well, thanks a lot for your impressions, also sharing your personal and emotional story. I will give it back to Grisha, because 𝐷𝐚𝐺 is reporting from the trial in German, Hebrew, and English as well. You should definitely check 𝐷𝐚𝐺 out for getting insights from the trial. What is your impressions from the trial, from the judge, from everything happening around the trial, and also how the media, the German, but also the international media, is reporting about this trial?
So first of all, it's amazing to see how many people who were affected, who are affected, are participating in this case. I mean, in this trial. It doesn't have to be like that. It's an opportunity, and a lot of people are taking it, which is great to see. in the first few days, there was, yeah, I mean, a lot of attention, international media from Israel, from the States, New York Times, all the press agencies. They came for the first days or day, let's say even day, got a few quotes, got a few interviews and vanished. So our goal was to stay, to report every day. We're going to publish a protocol for every day, which also has its problems because, as Rebecca said, how much do you give to the perpetrator? So we also decided to actually take out some parts of the protocols. That's another question. But we also want to still publish for every day a short report, but on time, like in 3 languages, the next day, the latest. So everyone who wants to follow can still follow the case, follow the trial, because other media disappeared. Other media has new topics, has new themes. I mean, also you can blame the media for that, but on the other hand, this is unfortunately how private media works. So we basically do this as voluntarily work. So we're not dependent on if it makes profit or if it makes, we're a non-profit organization, small NGO based in Berlin. So we can do this work, and we still think it's very important, even though we see ourselves that the attention disappears, also vanishes. Our posts are being read less. Like the Hebrew ones at some point gained some popularity because there's no coverage in Hebrew so far, except 1 or 2 articles in newspapers once in a while. So we hope, I mean, probably in the end of the trial, there will be another increase because the attacker will be sentenced, as everyone knows or expects. So that's so far for the media coverage. What's great to see is also that the judge is, from our perspective, is giving the co-plaintiffs the room. She could also interrupt that, and we've seen some cases where actually other lawyers or other people involved or state prosecutors are interrupting things. But so far the judge, I think, does quite a good job there. Because in the end, there are different interests in this trial. The state or the state prosecutor wants a quick trial, wants to finish, wants to sentence, guilty or not, but that's not in the interest of other people in the courtroom. So, and every few days, these interests clash. But so far, yeah, that's also another aspect that's great to see is the solidarity, especially from you guys, EUJS. I think you also gained some international attention through this. On the other hand, it's also kind of sad to see that you have to do this, that not the major society is stepping in. It's actually, I think, pointing out a flaw of the major society, a flaw that solidarity has to be organized by Jewish student organizations, or the demonstrations in front of the court is being organized by tiny leftist organizations. And a few days ago on Yom Kippur, probably everyone involved knows about this. There was this one press event where then some politicians show up to get their photos taken. But I think that's another line. I will stop here.
I mean, I can speak for myself. I don't know how the other panelists seen it, but I think the work you are doing is very important, and I'm very happy that you're doing this work. Maybe the question to Katharina, because Risha talked about how less German media, but especially also international media, are reporting about the trial. You, in your position and also working with different European countries, what was the reaction from different European countries, and why do you think this whole trial isn't so important for any other countries? Maybe you can explain a little bit, why do you think this is happening like this?
I'll do that in a minute with pleasure. But before, maybe allow me to thank all the co-plaintiffs, or people like Rebecca, for being in this trial, for testifying, for in a way rendering a service to the general public, because I believe, and I think Grisha is right when he says there is a lack of understanding among general public as to the dimension of this trial. By the way, in parallel, we also have the trial ongoing on the 𝐘𝐞𝐬𝐬 in Paris, which is also not gaining a lot of attention. It has more attention because of Charlie Hebdo, but with regards to 𝐘𝐿𝐬𝐬 itself, it is also very limited international attention. But I believe really, I'm impressed. I read the DEMOC reports regularly whenever they come out, because I want to follow and also know what is going on. I was impressed by the idea for those who wanted to support the co-plaintiffs to stand up rather than to clap while when it was prohibited, and to have these gestures of empathy, which is in the end, I think, a key when you think about people who were there to overcome this the trauma. Of course, this is not the prime role of the court, but it can be shown, as we see, by other people in the room. I'm also very impressed by the strength of those who testify and of the co-plaintiffs, and how after a year they have regained a lot of strength and put that at the disposal of the general public. I think that when it comes to how this is being perceived internationally, there is probably a lack of understanding on a very broad basis. I had a person in my room probably 2 or 3 days after the attack who said, was this actually an anti-Semitic attack? Because in the end, no Jews were killed. I mean, this is the dimension to which people who interact with the European Commission somehow also have totally a misconception, or also a misconception, of course, of the perpetrator's intention, but also of the effect it has on the community and on the survivors. Yeah. So yeah, it's I think this is really something where this is our, and I've said this repeatedly over the last months. In the first mandate, the last 5 years, what we did was really to ensure that we establish a basis for action on European level. We had a resolution in the European Parliament. We had a declaration in the European Council. Now, under the German presidency of the EU, there will be another declaration against anti-Semitism. We've established the IHRA definition. We've established certain tools to support member states in security, in education, and so on. But the real challenge now will be to broaden the basis and to inform general population about what anti-Semitism is and what effect it has. And I think we will have to use the structures. And this is why I'm also happy that, for example, the EUJS works in a larger forum, the European Youth Forum, for example, to to use those structures and to spread certain messages. And the European Youth Forum has adopted the 𝐼RA definition last year, I believe, for example. So, you know, I think this is what is our next step, to use the structures, the sports clubs, I don't know, the teachers associations. In Bavaria, for example, the special envoy has sent the 𝐼RA definition to 400 different NGOs, saying, you know, look into this when it's about anti-Semitism. This is your reference. And some of them started looking into their own history, and some where, for example, like the Schützenvereine, the shooting organizations, they have. They give this to their members because you know that in these organizations you can also have people with very right-wing views. So I think that it's this effort that we now need to ensure that the general public, that general society, realizes more the danger and understands the different forms of anti-Semitism.
Thanks a lot. And you mentioned a few things which I would bring on to Matthias, because we spoke a lot about what the European Commission did in combating anti-Semitism and also far-right extremism. Since this attack happened in Germany, and you know the German government, also a lot of German politicians, and know what have been done in Germany, how do you see the German politics reacted to this attack, and in general fighting the far right, and also maybe what the civil society can do? For example, Grisha mentioned that most of the solidarity actions came from civil society organization. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what have been done, what could have been done, and what is your point of view about this whole right-wing terrorism in Germany? Matthias, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I had some some problems with the connections, but hopefully you can hear me. Sorry for that.
You can.
Thank you for the question and for the interesting insights, and especially thank you for the work that DEMOC is doing, because for me as a researcher, these protocols are important, very important, because so we can reconstruct, we can get some insights in this trial. This is really important. To your question, and I think this regards the question why the media is not covering this process, this trial very close. I think we do have some serious problems in Germany, and one problem is that we are getting used to right-wing violence. It's horrible to say, but it's not that this is something very, very unusual. We have at the same time the trial against the murder of Walter Lübcke, for example. We had the Hanau attack, and this in a very small time scale. So I think this is part of the problem why this specific anti-Semitic attack from Halle and the trial is not getting so much attention as it should get. What we have in Germany on the federal level, for example, is now a federal cabinet of the federal government, especially talking about racism and far-right extremism. So there is some dispute why anti-Semitism is not part of the title of this cabinet. But on the other hand, the government made a lot of things in the last months, for example, with Felix Klein, who is is commissioned as for anti-Semitism on the federal level in a lot of federal states. We do have commissioners for Jewish life and anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism. There are the civil society organizations of RIAS who do document anti-Semitic incidents, and there is, of course, a broad civil society who is working against anti-Semitism. But after all, we do have to say that this comes too late. This comes all very too late. We don't have the debates within the state structures, the police, the justice system. And so it's very important, as Katharina von Schnurbein mentioned, to tell them what anti-Semitism is about. We don't have a legal understanding of about what anti-Semitism is. This is a problem in all days life. I want to mention one situation. There is sometimes there are graffitis in Germany which say Jews out, or who say Jews Jena, the city where I live and work, Jews Jena, and this comes out from the football scene. So it's used to discredit the other team, and of course it's an anti-Semitic slogan. But the police is already saying this is not political, that is not anti-Semitism, because it's out of the football context. And this is ridiculous. We don't have a system of hate crime in the legislation. We don't have a proper understanding about the question of minority protection until here. And we had a lot of tendencies to say, okay, we have to strengthen the civil society, we have to go into projects and to make some education and so on. And all this is very, very important. And there are a lot of great guys making a very great job. But what did not happen is that the state and the policy responsible persons that they work against and about anti-Semitism, that they understand what is the problem, how is the thinking working, and what is the problem about this. And I would say this is, as in Germany, as in the international context as well, a problem in the security services as well, because international, we had the debate that Islamism was considered as the greatest terrorist threat. This is a danger, of course, that cannot be denied, but it is very questionable whether it's really the greatest threat everywhere, because especially in Germany, but also in Italy, in Greece, in Sweden, and Eastern Europe, there is an everyday danger of right-wing extremist violence. And I would say this is probably a priority, and not just until since 1 or 2 years, but since decades.
Katharina, you wanted to say something, if I saw it correctly.
Yes, thanks. I just want to go back to what Matthias said about the hate crime and the understanding of anti-Semitism in relation, because I think it's important to understand. I mean, we have a definition for those who don't know it. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has adopted a definition that has been adopted by a lot of states, including Germany, as a basis to understand what anti-Semitism is. And the examples are not perfect, but at least they give an overview. Yeah. But what is important to understand is that not every example in this definition is illegal, but every example is anti-Semitic and therefore establishes an anti-Semitic bias. And this is where this definition is important. It can be a basis for the police, for prosecutors, for judges to establish a bias that then leads to this being categorized as a hate crime. So while before we actually didn't have this kind of category, now we can, there's also, like, the state of Bavaria has decided that no case with an anti-Semitic bias will be closed without proceedings. So that means you need to establish this anti-Semitic bias in order to then say, okay, and it will be trialed. Yeah. So I think we need to be careful there to understand how we can establish a bias. What is the use of establishing this bias through this definition, for then ensuring that the law can be applied according to a hate crime. I just wanted to explain that.
If I may, I want to say that thank you, Ruben. I want to say, first of all, that I really appreciate that comment from Katharina, because I think that it does add a lot of nuance in terms of something can be anti-Semitic, but not illegal, and kind of building on this aspect of nuance, something else I wanted to add is that I think we need to be very careful when figuring out not only the definition of anti-Semitism, but also the effects of anti-Semitism, that the Jewish community is extremely diverse, particularly here in Germany. Anti-Semitism affects Jews differently, even from one another. So our experience, for example, in Halle, we were a multi-generational group. We were a multinational group. We were all part of one community. We were all victims of this incident. And today I can tell you that there are people who are dealing with the trauma in different ways. There is most of the community, the Jewish community from Halle, are originally from the former Soviet Union. Most of them are a bit older, but not all of them. But they have a different way of coping based on their personal history than some members of the group that came together with Hillel, with Base Berlin, that have just different kinds of exposure to these things. And so at the risk of saying that, you know, there's one effect, I would be very careful about that. And kind of building on that, I would also hope that something that comes out of, you know, discussions like this that are so important, that are really calling for the activism that's needed, I hope that part of that activism can be an actual deeper understanding of the Jewish community, especially when we talk about Germany, because of how layered it is, because of how all of the different people, and I live in Berlin, so I know Berlin, but I also know that the communities outside Berlin are radically different very often than the Jewish community in Berlin. And so we need to also open the discussion about what it actually means to be Jewish and what it means to have not just a religious identification, but also distinct histories based on where our families have come from, distinct cultures, and how while we are, again, we are one community and we all should be a part of this together. We also need to acknowledge that, you know, there's a lot more understanding that could be done about what it means to be Jewish, and that there's not just one answer. This is an extremely nuanced conversation that will probably take time, but I just wanted to bring it to light so that we could all just acknowledge that that will also be part of the work when we deal with anti-Semitism and the challenges that it poses to all of us differently.
As a Jew in Germany, I can agree on everything you said perfectly. Before I go to my next question, I want to remind our viewers that you can ask questions, just write in the chat and we will come to them later. I want to come back to the ideology of the attack, of the ideology of the far right, because we talked a bit about conspiracy myths, and we also talked about how the far right, and also the attacker in Halle communicate about all the Jewish conspiracy myths and everything. I want to know, and this is an open question I don't know who wants to answer first. We see that also in the European Parliament and also in the German Parliament, a lot of the ideology the attacker believed in is part of so many speeches, namely by the AfD, by the FPÖ in Austria, and also other parties also in the European Parliament. How can we combat them, and is there a connection between the right wing in the parliament and the right wing on the streets? Maybe Katharina, Matthias, or Grisha, if you want to answer, feel free, whoever comes first.
Well, then I start. Okay.
Sure.
No, I do think that you know, there is a connection in the sense that the parliament is a reflection of mirrors in a way society and vice versa. So there clearly is an interaction. However, I think that it's important to understand also how this right-wing populism functions, how it can sow a seed that can then come to fruition. So I think it is important to see, and when we talk about how we can tackle it, my personal belief is that the most effective way of tackling anti-Semitism is really in everybody's immediate environment. What we see very often is that the left points to the right and the right points to the Islamists, and so we turn in circles, and everyone is very pleased with himself for pointing out anti-Semitism in another community. I believe the only way how we can actually tackle it is if those in a party, in a sports club, in a parents' association, in other NGOs, don't agree with something that somebody else has said, to speak up. So it costs something. It costs something also in the family circle, let's say, because we know that the current political environment even goes into dividing families. It's not easy, but this is, I think, the challenge and also the responsibility that each of us has to speak up in the situations when we hear it. And I mean, I've heard and seen situations also in the work environment. It is our responsibility there then to say something. So in order to be equipped for that, I think this is where we can again help with different forms and argumentations and so on. But the willingness to do so is something that is at the start, and I think a very important quality and necessity to achieve for any human being. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Does Matthias or Grisha want to answer the question as well, or not? Or maybe just say it in a different way. Is there because what we have seen a lot of times, or what we can read, is that people saying that the AfD, for example, is the parliamentarian arm of right-wing terrorism. Would you agree on this sentence, for example?
So, I mean, there are things like the narrative of the Great Replacement and these things that we see in different terror attacks, they're being reproduced.
Sorry, maybe you can just explain what the Great Replacement is, because I'm not sure if anyone who's listening to this discussion knows what the Great Replacement is.
I see. So the Great Replacement is this narrative of, sometimes it's called just the elite, sometimes it's spelled out as the Jews are basically replacing the population in different countries. So they're being accused of sending, in this case, Muslims to Europe. So, and this narrative is, very popular among populist right wing all over Europe and in the US. I don't really want to answer your question there, if they're responsible for that. I think I want to pick up what Katharina von Schnorbein said and emphasize that it's not just the fringe. We should understand that, sure, not just point at others, but also understand that the ignorance towards anti-Semitism, towards Judaism, is a problem of the major society. It's in this trial, we saw it in so many levels. On the day of the attack, the press didn't know it's Yom Kippur. They didn't know it's a synagogue. It took them a few hours to understand the scope even. The police, so many co-plaintiffs complained, and actually I think these are horrible statements if you go through them in detail, that the police, that the prosecutors didn't know it's a synagogue, didn't understand it's Yom Kippur, didn't understand what Yom Kippur means, that people were questioned over and over, why don't they have phones? Why don't they have IDs? after a horrible attack, horrible traumatic incident, this is how the major society basically responded, with kind of ignorance. And this, I think, we have to emphasize more and more. I mean, I don't want to play down the role of the populist parties and far-right terrorists who are a great threat. I don't know if we have to decide who's more dangerous or not, but yeah, this is what I wanted to add.
Katharina, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, maybe just to add with regards to victim support. This is something that we are looking into now. Also, there has been a legislation on European level with regards to supporting victim rights. And recently, the Commission adopted a strategy to ensure that this legislation is actually correctly applied, because the victim's perspective as such is a key to understanding and to really giving support to the victim. And I think that when you talk to people who think about, to members of the Jewish community thinking about leaving Europe in general, I'm not talking now specifically about Germany, but we know that in general, the Jewish community is unfortunately declining in Europe. So you ask them, you say, you want to go to Israel, it's not so easy to live there either. And they say, yes, but the state is on my side. And I think this is really the key. The state has to be on the side of the victim. And this is true not only for this terror attack, but it's true overall. If there is an incident between a student, let's say a Muslim student and a Jewish student in a school, there is a perpetrator and there is a victim. It is not for the school to solve the Middle East conflict. Yeah, so I think this is something that we must understand, that we have to take this perspective. And we know from our surveys, we did a survey among general population on their perception of anti-Semitism, that about half across Europe see the Jewish community in their country through the lens of the Middle East conflict. And in some countries, it's up to 85%. So basically, this idea is always in the back of the mind. And therefore, when it comes to Jewish victims, the idea that somehow they bring the anti-Semitism upon themselves is also still there. And that is an essential part of something that needs to be addressed in this general, I think in this debate, and also in the reporting about the Halle attack. And if this comes out of, at least to some areas of the society, that I think would turn this horrible attack into something meaningful to some extent, of course. Yeah.
Because you mentioned the victim support, I want to hand over to Rebecca, because you're also in contact with the victims of the Hanau attack, and also next week you're organizing, because for those who don't know, this week the Jewish Festival of Sukkot is starting, and Base Berlin is organizing the Festival of Resilience. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this, and also because people from Hanau are coming to this event, what they told you, what maybe the same stories regarding how the state reacted to both attacks. Maybe you can give us an overview about how both terror attacks are maybe also connected to each other.
Sure. So yes, we begin actually officially tomorrow night, the holiday of Sukkot. And the essence of Sukkot is really about, it's an ancient Jewish festival connected to the harvest season, or the end of the harvest season. And the major tradition is to go out of one's stable, permanent home, build a little sukkah, which is known as a tabernacle or a little hut or booth, and to make that a temporary home for a week. People have the custom of eating inside, some have the custom of sleeping inside. But what we thought to do for this holiday is to kind of pick up on this energy of kind of digging into what it means to be vulnerable and expressing that in a form of strength by going into these temporary spaces, and to turn that into another layer of a holiday of sorts. And we came up with the Festival of Resilience. And part of what that's about is about showing that despite many challenges of the past year, that we want to be able to shape the narrative in a distinctly Jewish sense, and talk not just about the trauma and not just, you know, the typical arc of one of these stories, but to really dig into what it means to be resilient and to celebrate our community as one that can come through, that can build on its strength, and that can find outlets for unity and for solidarity. And so that's how we came up with this concept. So we'll be building a very large sukkah in Berlin next week to celebrate that. And by the way, another element of the holiday of Sukkot is hospitality. Welcoming guests into a sukkah is a big part of it. So we are, in that spirit, very, very eager to really meet, fortunately, some of the Hanau community that are victims of the attack in Hanau. I'm really fortunate to be working with a team of volunteers. Some are survivors of the attack in Halle themselves. We're also working closely with the Amadeo Antonio Foundation, who also helped us get in touch with the initiative of the 19th of February to ensure that the conversation about Hanau is continuing. And we see this, you know, I personally, I will say I haven't had so much communication directly myself with the organization, although members of our team have, and I am so honored that they feel comfortable and safe to join this festival and to share this experience of resilience together. And I think, you know, for me, this is a really important goal, that we can say that resilience is something that we have to share, that in order to continue to build a safe and strong society, you know, as I said before, we have to, first of all, we have to understand what it means to be a Jewish person living in Germany, to living in Europe. And we also have to understand that some of the challenges that we're facing are things that we can help combat by coming together and bringing together these different communities. And so we'll have an opportunity to do that next week, and really hear from some of the people involved in making sure that the memory of the Hanau attack continues to be understood in the right way, that we can bring to bear some of the most important issues that all of our communities are facing. And hopefully that way, this is going to be the beginning of something. We're not going to solve all of the problems that right-wing extremism, as everyone has already mentioned, are giving to us, putting us through in the society. But I hope that we can just have the beginning of a longer relationship that allows different kinds of communities to come together and acknowledge that there are similarities and struggles that we can fight together in solidarity. So that's kind of my hope for that, and why we decided to kind of take charge of what the memory of the first week of October will look like for us.
That's really inspiring, and people can still register for the Festival of Resilience, right?
Very few spaces left for October 6th, which will be our main ceremony. But yes, if you can grab one, then you can still register.
People should check out
Still Corona times, I'm sorry.
Berlin's Facebook page. And I think we should come to the question from the audience. And I think the first question seems perfect for Matthias. While Halle seems right-wing inspiration, is there also a problem in Germany with left-wing anti-Semitism?
Yes, of course it is. Of course, there is a problem with left-wing anti-Semitism, but in my eyes, it's in our days. In maybe 40, 50 years ago, there was a problem with far-left terrorism against Jews as well. And the collaboration with Islamists, remember the attack from Munich, for example. But in our days, I would say it's especially linked to questions about anti-Zionism and the question about Israel-regarded anti-Semitism. It's the involvement of far left actors with the BDS movement, and these ideas of which are linked or identical with anti-Semitism, and sometimes the idea to be in a solidarity with the anti-imperialist movements of the Islamist scene that still is part of some left-wing groups, in particularly also part of anti-racist groups, but I don't have the in my eyes it's not the dominant power or force within the left in Germany. So I don't think that there is a real terrorist danger from the left side against Jewish but there will be some maniac who think it is part of his anti-capitalist struggle to attack Jews who are in his eyes responsible for all what he or she thinks is wrong in the world. So yeah, there is a problem, but the intensivity and the threat from far left or from left-wing anti-Semitism is, in my eyes, not so big as from the far right, because of the far right, anti-Semitism is part of the identity. There is no far right without anti-Semitism. This is true especially for the political parties as well as the AfD. Even they say very placativity that they are not anti-Semites and they stand with Israel. It's a complex and instrumentalizing relationship. But yeah, I think in my eyes, and a lot of scholars and researchers do say that of course anti-Semitism is a problem for itself. It's a phenomenon which can be left, right, which can be part of the so-called middle. There is anti-Semitism in liberalism, there's anti-Semitism in the conservative spectrum, in the left, in the right. We have to be very vigilant on all these sides, and should not close our eyes about on the left or on the right side.
Thanks for your answer. The next question is about internet, and because we talked about Telegram channels, and we talked about 4chan and 8chan, I will read the question now, and I think first, Katharina, you can answer it, and afterwards, because Grisha is monitoring all these internet activities, I would like to hear what you are saying, basically. Which steps do governments and the European Union need to take to better regulate online content?
Well, short question, but a very complex answer. So first of all, there is legislation which prohibits hate speech when inciting to violence. It also, by the way, prohibits or criminalizes Holocaust denial. But this legislation obviously needs to be enforced. There are different ways. One is to go to the platforms, and we concluded with a lot of the major platforms, and most recently TikTok joined a code of conduct in 2016, whereby they commit to take down illegal hate speech that is flagged to them within 24 hours. This was an immediate action that we took in 2016 in order to responsibilize the platforms and not to become platforms of hate. And so we were very clear to say what is illegal offline is also illegal online. And we've seen improvement with regards to their responsibility, their recognition, also their training of their staff to actually recognize hate speech, and also the rates of the takedown and the amount of takedown. However, of course, a lot of it is not flagged, and so there remains a lot of illegal hate speech online. And this is something that, you know, we continue to work on. And we have another avenue now, which will be the Digital Service Act that will be adopted before the end of the year, where we request certain conditions for businesses to do business on the net in Europe. This is a question of transparency, of data flows, of who is behind certain ads, certain postings and algorithms, and so on. And this will help to also identify and remove hate speech. But also the state has a responsibility, of course, with regards to the perpetrators. So the platforms need to look at their content, but the perpetrators need to be taken to court by the state. And as we know, you know, this needs a lot of manpower. It needs a lot of proactive investigation in the net to actually find who is behind certain hate speech. And that certainly will mean that increasingly also the police force, but also Europol and so on, will have to engage into this. And it's not that it's not happening, but we just simply need more and more coordinated action there as well. And then we have the whole area of disinformation, which, as we know, especially also from the Halle attack, can lead to hate crime in the real world. There we, on the one side, have created observatories, one observatory, but with different subsidiaries in the different member states that identify disinformation and either post something against it. So, you know, you don't take down because it's not illegal. I mean, this is also a question of balance between freedom of speech and hate speech. But we need to make clear that what the person is about to see is disinformation, is conspiracy, and therefore that the viewer should be warned. We've also, as an immediate reaction, because we saw how anti-Semitism was exploding during COVID online, we launched a Twitter campaign together with UNESCO, which is called Think Before Sharing, to debunk conspiracy myths and to help people identify and to know how to react. Of course, the first thing is not to share, but then also how to possibly engage or react to this. So it's, you know, there are many different aspects that are being tackled, from the business side to the prosecution side, and also then to the let's see, civil society area. But what is clear is that the internet has developed, and it's, I mean, in a large way is also positive, but into a mega data highway, and it needs rules, and these rules need to be clearly defined, and that's what we are about to do now with this Digital Service Act.
As you mentioned also the civil society, let me make a remark, what EUJS have done, for example, together with other Jewish organizations, that we did a call for a Digital Service Act, calling on the European Union, also governments, to make a change in their agenda on social media and digital and online hate speech. But I think, Grisha, you wanted to say something? Or you're good?
I can add something, but whatever you feel like.
We have a few moments left, so feel free to say something about this topic.
So what we notice in our work, looking into these holes of the internet, I mean, there's a difference between illegal things or terrorist content that clearly has to be taken down. The problem is then they will move on to other platforms. And I think one thing that is really missing or is not in the picture is big tech companies can pressure other companies because they're dependent on platforms like Google App Store or, for example, Telegram, which is, I mean, they're changing a tiny bit, but as I said, content is up for years, terrorist content, I won't go into it. But actors like Google, like Facebook, like other big giants can pressure players who don't want to play by the rules because they say, we're in another country, this doesn't apply, but still they want to be in the European market, they want to be in the American market, they want to be globally active. And app stores like Apple, like Google have a big influence on that. Losing their apps, Telegram is one example. Next thing is vKontakte. I don't know if you're familiar, it's a big thing in Russia. It's also, there's chaos. Things, people, terrorists, far-right terrorists get deleted on Telegram, they move on to vKontakte, for example. And there they are undisturbed, can do whatever they want. So this is one thing. And then the other thing, again, anti-Semitism is not always illegal. So I think there needs to be a lot of work done by civil society, by legislation, on a political level to make people understand that words lead to action, for example, that anti-Semitism online is not a world by itself. It's not just about freedom of speech. I mean, this narrative comes also from the US, for example. Yeah, but it's just an expression. But no, I think by now we can see and have to point out over and over again, unfortunately, that it leads to actions like Halle.
Thank you so much. And because we're running out of time, I have one last question. Since we entered the Jewish year 5781, more or less a week ago, I want to know from all of you in one sentence, what do you wish for the next Jewish year and what should have happened and what you're looking forward? And I don't care who is starting, feel free to answer if you feel like this. But someone has to start.
Then I make a start. I just hope and I wish and I hope the next year will lead to this. Also, we are very far from this situation that we learned that Jewish life is a totally normal thing in the German society.
I go next. I hope specifically that the 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany that will be celebrated all over Germany next year will actually increase the understanding of Jewish life and Judaism in the broader society. And Shana Tova.
If you don't want to answer, this is also very fine. If
I'll
not, you want to
answer? Yeah. My hope for this coming year is that we can truly make a step forward in detaching trauma from what it means to live a Jewish life, and that the more people will understand that Jewish people and Judaism is rooted in so much more. And I hope that we can really achieve a level of detachment from that. And I hope that this will be one of the last panels that I sit on that is like this, about this topic as a Jewish person.
Risha, you want, or should I answer the question for myself as well?
Yes, please.
Okay. I hope that next year will bring us more solidarity, and this brings me also to a small advertising for the next event of the Jewish Student Union of Germany, because as many of you maybe noticed, we collected around 28,000 euros for the owners of the kebab shop where Kevin was murdered, for Rifat and Ismet Tekin. And next week, on the 7th of October, at 4 p.m. in Halle, we will hold a rally and commemorating the attack, and also bringing the money to Ismet and Rifat, because the financial help which they got promised by the government, by the state government, and also any other help is not there. And we want, this is, I think, an act of solidarity which we can bring to the society, saying that we believe in multiculturalism. And yes, I hope this will be the guideline for the next Jewish year. More solidarity, less hate. I wish you all Shana Tova, and I thank you all for joining us tonight. I thank my perfect panel. I think this was one of the best panels I could moderate in my life so far. Yes, and thanks for joining. Have a good night.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks.